Welcome to the Fowl Front Podcast.
Welcome to the Fowl Front Weekly After Action Review.
All right, welcome podcast listener people and outdoors enthusiasts. Thank you for listening to the Fowl Front AAR. Welcome to the 7th episode, powered by the Waypoint Outdoor Collective, where your host, me, Ben Page, walks you through what I thought was some of the best content of the podcast and outdoors world this week. A little quick update on what's going on with me. I am recording this. It's like 1 a.m. right now. So just a couple hours before you're hopefully listening to this. Been dealing with a fire alarm situation with a sleeping baby all night. And if you've never tried to figure out why fire alarms or how to test them or, the central lines with a baby that's trying to sleep, it's one of the more terrifying things I've ever done. At any rate, iTunes switched up their categorizations, so I'll probably talk a little bit about that next week. You might not find us in the regular spots, or most people in the regular spots, but we'll figure it out. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what listening to like 12 hours of podcasts a week does to your brain. Probably can hear it right now. No, I'm complaining, obviously. But yeah, moving on. Should we get down into the countdown? Make this a little bit quicker so you can navigate through this stuff and I don't cloud you up any more than you need to, which is the exact opposite of what this podcast is supposed to be doing. Anyways, honorable mentions. For this week, we got Cal's Week in Review, which is it's always a good quick listen that gives some humorous insight into some actually important topics in the outdoors world and information that's actually super interesting. The Lone Duck's Gundog Chronicles is also an honorable mention, and this week he sits down with a really great guy, an Addison Edmonds of Gunner Kennels, and is also your go-to dog training podcast. We've also got the End of the Line podcast featuring the serial tale of Ryan Warden, who got hemmed up with the feds with some tagging issues and some other stuff with the federal game wardens from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service a couple of years back. So it's actually a pretty interesting story. You should go check it out. And if you're into fishing, check out the Tom Rowland podcast and Salt Strong's most recent episode on the Waypoint Outdoor Collective Podcast Network. All right. Coming in at number 7, we got the HP Outdoor Waterfowl Podcast, episode 144, which was released on a Saturday, which is atypical of them. And they talk about comfort in the field. Now, I didn't find this to be particularly conservation-driven or anything of that nature, but it does talk about how you can stay out in the field longer. It talks about some of the products that they use to increase their comfort. And yeah, at the end of the day, 2 good dudes talking about hunting ducks. All right. Number 6, we've got the MVM show, Mid-Valley Mercenary is what MVM stands for. Episode number 17, where they're talking duck hunting with my good buddy Jordan Fromer. And I think some of the best parts of this episode is hearing about Jordan, one of the co-hosts of the Duck Gun podcast, and much more. Discuss his journey from recording. He literally recorded his first duck hunt to running a YouTube channel and a podcast. Now he's working with an outdoor company called HTR Innovations that makes blinds and some really cool gun stands and some comfy layouts. Anyways, what are you going to get out of this episode? So if you're a fan of either of these shows, it's really great to hear good dudes actually talking to one another, because you guys might not know this, but all these podcast guys they're all great dudes. All the YouTube dudes are great dudes. They also talk about Jordan chasing all the openers from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan down through to the southern portion of his home state in Indiana, and then all the zones in between that he'll be hunting. He's going to try to chase the opening weekend each week. And they also touch on some tips for training older dogs, or how Jordan's going about it at least, and some future plans, and then all the collaboration between the YouTube crew that's coming up. All right, at number 5, Jake Latondres and Jessica DeLorenzo's Outdoor Cameraman Experience, episode number 9. Hosts Jessica and Jake released 3 episodes this week, and if you're a photographer or you're an inspiring photographer and you're listening to this, you must be into hunting. But if you're listening to this, the Outdoor Cameraman Experience needs to be on your weekly rotation. It kind of gets you into the heads of 2 extremely smart and very passionate and successful photographers. And like I said, this week they released 3 episodes. The first was an interview with Bill Buckley, a fellow photographer, and they discussed some pretty entertaining stories, one of which being about a feller named Coonfoot, for good reason. They also talk about overproduction of photography, especially in the hunting sphere, and then they even throw in some tips in there for waterfowl hunting photography. So, yeah. They also interview a Brandon Fiend, who is a 16-year-old photographer who does like really amazing stuff. He's got a cover photo on wildfowl, and he essentially turned his chore money into a budding and really bright photography career, the start of one, and it's really inspiring and pretty refreshing to hear some younger guys that have the right mindset and approach. And I was extremely motivated. All right, number 4, we've got the Meat Eater Podcast, episode 178, titled "Hunting Mammoths." Stephen Ranella sits down with David J. Meltzer and Giannis, and then they discuss archaeology. So if you've ever been interested, or if you are interested in the prehistory of North America, how we got here, when you think of the land bridge, what do you think of? How people got over here from Asia and then worked their way down to South America. When you think of the land bridge, what do you think of? I can tell you, most of you are probably extremely wrong about what that looked like. They talk about, the entire way that we've discovered all these ancient civilizations and kind of some really, really, really interesting talking points. And they cover, clearly they cover some portion of mammoth hunting. Really interesting podcast, especially if you're into history, archaeology, or just broadening, and I wouldn't say broadening, deepening your knowledge of what happened on the ground that you hunt and live and work on in history. So definitely go check that one out. All right, coming in at number 3, we got the Duck Gun Podcast, episode 104, the commie state of California. This week, Elliot and Jordan sit down and talk with Titus from the MVM show from Mid-Valley Mercenaries, as previously discussed, about the really strict, restrictive, and frankly, concerning laws regarding ammo, hunting, and some of the red tape that Titus has to deal with over in the Pacific Flyway in California. So what are you going to get out of it? What are you going to get out of this episode? Titus lays the picture, right? California restrictions, laws, regulations, firearm stuff, everything we know about California, and some crazy stuff that they got to do to hunt, and if you want to come in and hunt. And then he paints the picture of the California that he knows, that a lot of us we don't get to see that. Hardworking, agrarian type folks and unique waterfowl hunting situations. And I think this episode is extremely important because it highlights the story of California regulations on these types of things, and it gives an ominous foreshadowing for the rest of us if we don't really step up to the plate and show how important we are to conservation and begin shifting the narrative and the perception of who we are as hunters and conservationists. For that reason, it's extremely important. All right. Number 2, the Big Honker Podcast, episode 189, Dale Bordelone. Probably the most interesting character ever to make an appearance on the Big Honker Podcast, and that's saying something. He lives in the heart of the North American duck history capital of the world, and the central tenet of kind of waterfowl culture that I'm not too familiar with. Dale is, I don't know if he's a hyperbolic example or an over-exaggeration example of Cajun culture and its revolution around waterfowl hunting, or if it's really just more commonplace. But he really, when they talk to him, when Jeff and Andy talk to Dale, it paints this picture of a man who is extremely in touch with his roots and his culture. He talks about how he makes traditional boats literally from digging them out of a 4-foot wide cypress tree, to cutting and harvesting his own calls and his own tuning boards by hand. And then all the food, gar balls. I've never heard of those, so if you're interested in figuring out what a gar ball is, go check out the Big Honker Podcast, episode 189. So they talk about the food and culture, and even his accent, which can sometimes be a little hard to understand, is absolutely entrancing. And this is an important episode because it brings to the forefront what I would consider a culture that without waterfowl hunting or waterfowl in general would lose something. Maybe it would lose itself to the new world if we don't preserve it. And it's just fascinating to hear about and experience a group of people through this interview, and then a style of hunting and life that I really have no idea about and zero exposure to. For that reason, it's definitely a must listen. Big Honker Podcast, episode 189, Dale Bordelome. All right. You guys are going to, you know what? I don't care. This week's number one is The Hunting Collective, episode 71. And I know it's been 5 weeks in a row, but this week Ben O'Brien talks about exploring consumption and ethical veganism with Professor Robert C. Jones. You're probably, like I said, you're tired. You're tired of seeing The Hunting Collective at the top of this list, but it's my damned moral obligation to highlight this episode and the work that Ben O'Brien's doing over at the Meat Eater and the Hunting Collective podcast. This week he talks about his visit with Robert Jones, a professor in philosophy at UC Berkeley and a vegan who is at the forefront of unpacking, which is a philosophical term, what it means to be a vegan and what it means to be a consumer in this world. And so he's the opposite of Ben, right? Or so you'd think. They discuss the different approaches that they take to being a mindful interactor or consumer of the natural world. And I think that if every hunter in America listened to this episode, the hunting lifestyle and movement would be a lot better for it. We can be pretty ignorant and we can be pretty, don't take our guns, gonna go kill. That's people, they see that. They see us doing that. And I think if everybody kind of could take a step back, look in the mirror, see themselves accurately, or see themselves through the lens of how somebody else might perceive you, it would be a lot better for the lifestyle that we want to continue moving forward. So yeah, turns out it's pretty interesting seeing two guys on the opposite sides of the spectrum, but who have so much more in common than the masses of the people in between them. I've talked about it before, the apathetic, I would say. But yeah, all right, guys, gals, hope this was helpful. Sorry we didn't have any waterfowl news this week. It was just kind of a tight week. A lot of work going on. Some pretty cool stuff coming up. I guess as Jeff Stanfield's dad Ron says, it'd be a sorry dog that don't wag his own tail. This last week on the Fowl front, we had a pretty interesting episode with Ted Wells in the Glassing Hour. And it was, Ted's a great guy, and you should go check that out, especially if you're into photography or hunting photography. Next week, I'm talking to a buddy of mine who is a relatively new hunter, and we're going to get after a lot of topics. And it's a really cool episode. It's not what you think it is, and I'm really looking forward to seeing your guys' reactions on it. Okay, hey guys, hit me up at foulfront@gmail.com with any questions, concerns, and go ahead, leave a review, hopefully a 5-star one, and leave a written review. And you guys have a great weekend, and hopefully you can take this and pick out some episodes that you want to listen to next week. All right.